Chapter 10. The Tempering. So it was that same night the three travelers crossed the southern slopes of the high hills, and came at last down into the fair land of Bryhane. They found the pass without trouble, and came through it into country that Kermorven knew well. Even in the dark, with only a faint moon glimmering through the high clouds. Through the heavy clouds, he was able to guide them along many little winding paths on the hillsides, and lead them so well that when they at last made camp by the mouth of a narrow dale, the hills lay behind them. Beside their camp, a small, swift stream disappeared downhill in a stairway of falls and deep pools, and at dawn next day, having bathed in the pools, they followed it on its way. It wound away between little stands of trees, across patches of green meadow, and came at last to a low stone wall which marked the edge of a vineyard. Already the fruit hung heavy on the vines as they passed. "A good vintage this year, by the look of it," said Ilse. "But who will harvest it, I wonder?" said Elof. "Listen." "I hear nothing," said Ilse, puzzled. "Nothing indeed," said Elof. "Beyond the vines lie fields, farm, and yet these farmers are surely not greater sluggards than the northerners I knew. Some at least should be up and at work now. You hear the clink of hoes, the cackle of fowl, the call of animals driven to pasture or to milking?" "Nothing," said Ilse. And so it was. It was now high summer, and those lands were at their richest, the corn ripening all across the broad plains, the fruit swelling on the orchard boughs. Yet the only sound of man in them was the rumor of distant war, and it echoed in emptiness. All the folk had fled. "A few, perhaps, will have gone inland," said Kermorven, as they walked down to the first river ford, "westward towards the wild lands around the roots of the mountains, where I suppose the Duergar gates are, Ilse. But that to us is rough and dubious country. Most of them will now be within the walls of the city, eating up its store of supplies, draining its wells and crowding it out so sickness spreads. I would not have admitted the peasants, but the syndics will." "It seems the kinder course," said Elof doubtfully. "Kind for the moment, unkind for the future. They will hinder and weaken our defenses, and perhaps bring doom upon everyone when they would have been as safe or safer inland." "Even so," said Ilse, "could you drive them clamoring from the gate?" "I would never have let them reach the gate to begin with, made preparations, issued commands against any emergency, and seen that they were understood, as they would be, were the need made clear. How else may a realm be defended? But this the syndics will not do, lest they alarm the poor tender people. Well, I'll wager they are alarmed now." And he strode splashing fiercely across the ford, checking his pace not the least against the strong current that tugged at their ankles. The three hardened travelers, this was an easy country, its paths and rutted roadways a great luxury. They made a fast pace, and it was not yet noon when they crested the first range of hills between them and the city. Now it was only some 5 or 6 leagues distant, and much clearer to see, though the air shimmered with the midday heat. From a brooch it had grown to a great shield shape, set upon a checkered blazon of fields, and with high-crowned towers for its boss, atop a stone hill from which the ivory walls ran outward as ripples spread in water. A fair sight it would have been in days of peace, but now both blazon and shield bore the strokes and scars of war. Smoke arose in great wreathing coils from many of the blazoned fields, brown as the scars of some spreading disease among the rich greens and yellows of summer. The sea, too, was stained, its tarnish clear now as innumerable black flecks of sail. Many as there were, the high walls dwarfed them, and from within these no smoke came. But it was clear the city was now encircled, the siege begun. It was a great sight, and a terrible one, that beleaguered burg. Glamorgan took one horrified look, and would look no longer, but strode down the slope into the vale beyond. Elof and Ilse looked at one another, and ran after him. The valley below was wider, and its floor less even, but Glamorgan went striding across the lands like a man within yards of his own threshold, and a storm coming on. The others had to hold him back almost forcibly, and remind him that it would do no good to arrive at the city exhausted and without due care. It was as well they were heeded, for in crossing a small farm they rounded a corner and came suddenly upon a foraging party of Eqwesh, 9 in all, lolling at their ease among the arbors. For a heartbeat, their stern copper faces were blank with astonishment. Then Glamorgan was among them before they could drop their looted wineskins and snatch up their spears. He fell upon them like a howling wind. 3 he slew with 2 great slashing strokes, even as they scrambled up, and 2 he felled in a breath when they stood to fight. Elof and Ilse caught up then, and engaged the rest. The dark swords sang in the light as it shattered their spears. Ilse with her axe hewed the legs from one. Elof thrust through another who sought to stab her, and the last 2 turned to flee. But Glamorgan caught them by the farmhouse wall, knocked one sprawling, and cut down the other among the splintered debris of the door. A fallen warrior sprang up with a long knife poised to throw, but Ilse's axe struck him between the shoulders, and he fell. Glamorgan drove his sword through him. "For none," he said, "must escape to give the alarm, or we would be hunted down in hours. I doubt not that the land is alive with them, for with so large a force they cannot have brought much provender. We must go carefully. Well, they have a few less mouths to feed now, and ere long, I hope, fewer yet. Let them dine on these their friends, if they find them." For all Glamorgan's words of caution, he still led them at great speed across the country, only taking more care around estates and dwellings. These were few and scattered. "Does Bryhane not have any other towns?" Elof asked Glamorgan. "Only 3 of any size. A port to the south, named Bryhenech, and 2 inland towns. Our ports to the north are smaller, about the size of your large Northland towns. Most people prefer to dwell within one great center, a legacy, perhaps, of the days when we first came to this land across the eastern ocean, and were alone among immense forests and mountains, vaster than aught we had left behind. Even now we still cleave to the coast, wherever we settle." They saw 3 other Eqwesh parties before they left the valley, but only at a distance. They were sauntering along, evidently not expecting trouble, so it was safe to assume the others had not yet been missed. As night fell, the travelers came into the first slopes of the hills, and made a comfortable camp in a shepherd's empty hut. They ate well, though they lit no fire. "Our food is all but gone," said Ilse, sleepily. "What of it?" said Glamorgan, already wrapping himself in his stained cloak. Tomorrow we will win through to the city, or have no cares about food thereafter, as well keep up our strength. Tomorrow, thought Elof, as he sought the sleep he felt he would never find. Tomorrow the city, what then? Will I find it then? That one more thing I need? Can I possibly find it in time? But then sleep stole on him unbidden, and he walked through uneasy dreams. Faces swirled before him, translucent against darkness like moonlit clouds. Faces of ills, Kermorven, of Rock, and ever of Kara. But behind them all came the sword, its fell patterns no longer fixed, but swirling like oil on water, changing so he could read them like script, and he knew with mounting excitement that it was about to reveal to him the secret he needed to know. Then it shimmered, shook, swirled again, and the pattern twisted into hateful faces that leered and mocked at him. And still the sword advanced, swelled, and grew gigantic, till it struck at him with a crash and a rumble. Falling mountain, he was cloven to the heart. "What was that?" he cried, sitting bolt upright. Then he realized he had been dreaming, and yet it seemed to him that faint echoes of his dream still shivered through the cool dawn air. "A single thunderbolt," said Kermorven softly from his place by the doorway. "The flash awoke me. Yet such a thing is rare in our summer storms. Strange. Still, the awakening came timely. We must be on our way." Elof and Ills rose, grumbling a little, and made a hearty breakfast on the last of their stores, while Kermorven fumed and fretted and would hardly touch a morsel. He even grudged them minutes to splash water on their faces at the nearby spring before setting off up the hill. But now he kept a more cautious pace, an eye on the land around, and great care that they should not show themselves. This close to the city, they dared not cross the hill crests and be seen against the sky, but walked a weaving path between the slopes, ever alert for sign or sound of danger. It was late afternoon, therefore, when they made their way into a little coppice of trees that skirted the last and lowest slope. Elof knew they could not be far now, for the sound of the sea was faint in his ears, and he could taste it on the breeze. But there were other sounds and taints also, less welcome. "Here we may rest a while and scout out our way," said Kermorven. "The far end of this looks out upon the city." They came to a line of trees linked by a great bank of bushes and tall ferns. Cautiously he parted them and peered out. Then Elof heard him catch his breath. It sounded like a sob, whether of rage or sorrow or despair, he could not tell. He pushed forward also, and looked out. He, too, caught his breath at the sight before him. "Reminds me of my own village," he said softly and choked. "You will think that foolish, when it could have fitted into a tiny corner of this great burg." Kermorven shook his head firmly, though his face was gray. "No, ever foolish. The lesser must be free of this slaughter, or how shall the great endure? It is the same, and as evil, be it writ large or small." "He is right," said Ills. She unslung her pack, and pulled from it a bright shirt of fine mail. "Your folk, mine, his, their deaths weigh every bit as heavily in the scale, and the balance is a fearful one. This must stop." They were no more than a half league now from the city walls, on a level with its highest towers, and it lay spread out before them. To Elof's eyes, it seemed to spill outwards from a central hill, outwards across the flatter lands to either side. A great encircling wall, fronting the harbor, and running from there inland in a horseshoe shape, seemed barely able to contain such a vast, sprawling scatter of rooftops, all shades of slate, gray-green, and weathered ivory. It seemed to Elof that his village, and every other village and town he had ever seen, whether of men or Duergar, might be dropped among them all together, never noticed. Ivory also were the high walls which meandered here and there between the rooftops, setting off one section of the city from another in a way that looked at first meaningless, till he realized he was seeing the history of its growth, outwards like the rings which mark the passage of seasons in a tree. In their way, these rings were also a mark of time and growth. When, every few generations, the community dwelling beyond the walls had grown too large to defend from within, they would simply build another section of wall, or even an entire new encircling wall round it. Sometimes the wall behind might be demolished, but most often it was left as an extra line of defense. Elof traced these walls inward, marveled at the number of them. This city was an ancient place, and no part of it seemed more ancient or more noble than what he saw at its heart, wellspring of all that growth. The heart of the brooch, Field Boss, was a rising promontory of rock, a gentle slope on its narrow landward side, but dropping as a sheer cliff to the waters of the harbor. Atop this, like a high crest on a helm, it bore up a great fortress of 7 high towers. Gray were the lower slopes of the citadel, for they were carved whole from the living rock. But above them the towers were of ivory stone, as also the walls and roofs that ran between them. They stood like a diadem on the brow of the rock, tallest of them rising straight up from the cliff face above the waters. And the tops of the towers glowed under the noon sun, more brightly even than the sea which lay beyond them, for they were roofed all with bronze, crowned in bright gold. So much Elof would have seen if he had first gazed upon Cirbrahein the city in the days of its peace. There might perhaps have been great ships stirring in the harbor, white sails aspread, or a thin wisp of smoke arising from some great cooking fire in the citadel, where an evening's banquet was being prepared. Now there was more, much more. The sun still shone mellow upon the tower tops, the many-hued banners they bore swirling proudly in the wind from the sea. But against them rose banners greater and more telling, dark reeks that heralded no feast fit for men, high plumes of black smoke from the ruined lands around. From here the devastation worked upon those lands was all too clear. The scatter of camps, emplacements, trenches, and hasty fortifications, and the files of black-clad warriors that flowed among them like ants from a nest. What had once been buildings beyond the walls were but blackened shells now. What had been fields and pastures and parks were trampled down and strewn about with litter of war gear, loot, and debris. What must have once been pleasant groves beneath the walls had been hewn down and stacked against the gates, or made into great laddered platforms to be pushed on rollers against the walls, and spill warriors inside. The harbor, too, was despoiled, its waters choked now with the skeletal remains of ships, some beached, some thrust up out of the polluted water. Beyond the seawall, the sails that crowded shore and sea around like a spreading stain were every one of them black. The grim hulls of the Eqwesh rode at anchor, the livid faces painted along their flanks, menacing the city with gaping jaws. From their decks, as from the land, catapults raked the ramparts with terrible volleys of arrows, harpoons, and shot of metal and stone. But it was not only from field and sea that the banners of destruction arose, for new fires had sprung up. The ruin outside had entered. The outermost encircling wall, only the day before had stood a stern bulwark against the spreading reek, now bore a terrible wound in its northern flank, a great jagged collapse of stone, scarred black and ashen as if by blasting heat. Into it, like a plague, streamed the black and white banners of the Eqwesh. Beyond it, rooftops of gray and cream lay broken, and among them danced triumphant fires. Through the shattered streets, figures of men flickered back and forth in bitter conflict, darting and dodging among the buildings, and on parts of the wall above. Defenders still strove to turn back the enemy, lest they be pinioned from both sides. But the banners pressed even further and further on, and more advanced from outside. It was like a blight that had settled on a fair flower, and now was creeping inwards by degrees, towards the heart. Already the somber ensigns flew above a high round tower at the harbor end of the wall, and behind its battlements of sea-whitened stone, robed figures were gathering. The first wall was breached, overwhelmed, futile, first circle taken. Eqwesh had overwhelmed the outer defenses, or within the city. "How?" whispered Kermorven in anguish. "That wall should have held many days yet, even against this force. Yet already they stand upon Vade's tower. Dare! What sorcery has done this?" Elof looked long and hard at that blasted gap, and in his memory embers burst into sudden flame. Suddenly he was back on another hillside, above another town, with the echoes of another thunderbolt yet ringing in his ears. "Sorcery indeed," he breathed, and a black anger awoke in him. So my town was taken. There was any doubt, it ends now. He is here, for he has woken the lightning to break your walls." "That, then, what we heard?" muttered Kermorven, shaking his head. "But the outer wall has fallen. The inner ones are in less good repair. Why should he not strike them at once?" "Because the spell exhausts him. He must dance himself to a frenzy in heavy costume and mask, and put forth great power, greater here than he used against Assenby, where he had only to strike down a man, not a wall. He will not do that again this day. But tomorrow—" "By tomorrow's dawn," grated Kermorven, "his dance will be stilled forever. Look there." Kermorven's keen eyes narrowed. He was staring across to the roof of the captured tower, almost level with them now. Elof followed his look. Even at this distance, the figures were distinct in the clear light. Some bore spears and black and white armor. Most wore the robes and hats of chieftains. But among them walked one whose robes were plain black and without ornament, though he bore some great crested headdress. To the ramparts he came, mounted them, and leaned over with arm outstretched. As he did so, as trumpets blazoned rising discord, the smoky sunlight flashed sullen and strange from the blade he swept in a wide arc, like some terrible scythe of the unseen. One of the crude siege platforms was hauled rumbling forward against the defended end of the wall. The first warriors were poised ready to spring down, when grapples were flung from the ramparts, and a smoking barrel of oil or tar was rolled out and down into its heart. It blazed at once like a gigantic torch, and shadows capered in the flames and fell from its ladders, ants caught in a bonfire. Then the grapples were hauled back, and the whole ramshackle structure lurched, tilted, folded inwards, and collapsed upon the fleeing Ekwesh beneath. But even as it crashed in ruin, banners dipped and signaled from the tower, and catapults, mangonels, and other engines were drawn up to harry the wall anew. Boulders drummed upon the stonework, smashed the turrets, sent crenellations flying in deadly splinters. Darts hailed down on the parapets, and stricken men toppled over onto the heads of their foes. Another platform was pushed forward, files of men gathering around it, but they seemed to falter a moment in their advance as they came within range of the burning tower. Again, the swords scythed out into the air. The invaders' battle line blurred, blended, and seemed together like the orderly traffic of an anthill stirred by a child's stick. The new assault washed forward through the flaming ruin of the last as if it were not there. Onto the platform men crowded as it was thrust forward, and even before it crashed and swayed against the wall, they were hurling themselves down upon the very spear points of the defenders, overwhelming them in a tumbling, insane wave. Flame raced among the dry fields from the fallen tower, and smoke hid the scene. Elof turned away, hand to his mouth. A great emptiness seemed to open up inside, a still void in which thought and feeling alike were swallowed up. Sir Morven looked at him fiercely, questioningly. Elof nodded once, and felt a bitter, salty taste flood his mouth, a sickening, bloody taint. He spat into the bushes at his feet, and it was blood. There was a sudden sting in the back of his hand. He had bitten deep into his finger without noticing. "Then all that remains is to bring you to him," said Kermorven calmly. Cold eyes met Elof's, and his face was as bleak as his words. "For this I have passed over ice and sea and many other perils. I will not now fail. Will you?" Numbly, Elof shook his head. "Very well, then. We will wait here until dark. Then I will bring you to the city and the tower through the Ekwesh lines. But you, lady," he added, turning to Ilse, "you have come further with us than you meant. You were best stay here for now, for you may yet turn for home should things go ill." She glared at him. "Skulk here when things are just getting interesting? You'd think you'd have got this far without me? No, my lad, I come also. Or do you fear they will not welcome me in that fine burg of yours?" "They will," said Kermorven grimly, "since you are with me. But later, there may be many old errors to be set right." Many times that day they saw the swords sweep out over the city, and watched visions of fear and horror take form in its shadow. Men, made mad, were driven against their adversaries like chaff in a wind, till blood ran in dark streams down the warm stone. Sometimes the sword would be brandished out towards the harbor, and more of the dark ships would come crowding ever closer in among the hulks, sweeps threshing in the narrow channels as if to waken the drowned who lay below. At last, one small ship dared to sail right in under the shadow of the high tower, tilting its bow catapult skyward. A harpoon-sized bolt struck into a tower window with a wide gallery beneath. A rope was hauled up by its cord, and up this swarmed Ekwesh with bows and spears slung at their backs. Half dangling by their hands, half walking up the rock face, they were almost at the gallery, some 60 feet above the harbor, when the next window opened. A pikehead caught in the rope against the rock and severed it. Climbers had never a chance, but fell away with it, the land shattered against deck or water. The oars began to back water frantically, but then something of great size and weight was tilted over the gallery rail. It fell spinning straight down upon the hapless ship, clove its foredeck, and smashed through the planking. Water fountained upward. The ship lurched and listed. The mast toppled, and bodies spilled into the water on either side. The defenders leaned over the gallery with jeers of triumph, but the stern catapult was still manned, and a hail of heavy shot pounded all around the window. The great gallery cracked, fell away from the wall, and crashed down in ruin upon the sinking vessel, the swimmers around it, bringing defenders and attackers alike to a common end. Sickened, Elof rested his head in his hands. Only the sounds could he not shut out. As dusk gathered, these slowly stilled, and it was smaller fires that sprang up in the gloom, the attackers retreating to their camps. But there was no peace in the quiet that settled over the beleaguered city then. It was a taut, watchful quiet, the desperate stillness of the wounded beast shivering in its retreat. And over the camp was the quiet of the hunter, watching, waiting, with the blood scent already in the wind. The three travelers could sense that watchfulness as they slipped out from among the trees. There was a faint glow of moonlight. They made their way slowly from bush to bush, from tree shadow to line of hedgerow or fence, and across the fields these guarded. But the fields bore no crops save ashes, and among them many bones of those who had not had time to reach shelter, men and animals both. The first onslaught had been sudden, city ill-prepared. That much was obvious, and Kermorven ground his teeth as they passed. Many of the human skulls, all. "It will be paid for," he muttered, "and not only by the Ekwesh, if I have my way." It was 2 hours, perhaps, before they came within sight of the besiegers' outer lines, and found just beyond them a wide chain of picket camps, with many men patrolling the darkness between their fires. "They are alert," muttered Kermorven, as they crouched in the shadow of a tumbled wall, by the blackened skeleton of a tree. Victory or defeat must hang on a hair now. Tomorrow morning. He said no more. They knew. Tomorrow would bring a bolt to shatter another wall, and perhaps with it the flagging will of the city. And that alertness will make our task harder. To reach the tower, we must enter the city somehow, and that will mean getting past the guards at the breach, their fires, and slinking through the streets. A slow and perilous task that will be. It would be quicker simply to cut around the top of the walls, but... Elof coughed hesitantly. There is something that might make it easier, at least as far as the walls. I'm not sure. Token. I had it from the forest. He reached into his pack and pulled out the sprig of wood. The others eyed it uneasily. Token, you say? Whispered Ills. But how will that serve? He was answered as the scent reached them. A warm smell, resinous, heavy, heady. It seemed to flood the mind and sing there like the thin song of insects in a warm, still twilight. Elof held up the sprig, and it was as if the dead trees above them awoke, summoned up the ghosts of its leaf-heavy limbs, and set them swaying in the strange breeze, casting their old, wide shadow in the pale light. Then Elof turned the sprig, and it seemed that the shadow spread outward from his arm, flowing and pooling in the darkness like blood from a secret slaying. And through it ran that heady heaviness, rich with soft rustle of a quiet forest, a safe place to rest one's weary limbs, to forget one's troubles and fears, to let one's leaden head nod a moment, find peace. Through the gloom moved the travelers, and it seemed to them that light leaf mold rustled beneath their feet, that the sounds of harsh voices and the clink of weapons and armory, and even the sound of the sea faded into the small night noises of any woodland, that the smells of cooking, of blood, of death, vanished among the many strong scents of trees. Not the sharp evergreens of Tapiau's forests, but the blossoming fruit trees that must till recently have flourished here. So perhaps they also were revenged upon their slayers, for the travelers slipped like ghosts themselves among the lines of picket and sentry, moved between the trenches and the fosses and the tents of dark hide. Sir Morven had noted each position of the enemy, each obstacle on their path, at any given moment. Though he could not see far ahead, he knew what must lie there. When he was in any doubt, Ills, to whom the dark was no greater than that of the Duergar's delvings, could set them aright. But always as he turned and twisted the little bough, Elof felt a light pattering on his hand, as a few more needles fell away. So they passed through the lines of the enemy, and came at length to the wide breach in the wall, like the outline of a great blazing spearhead that had struck down into the stone, splintering, shattering, melting to nothing. The black-armored sentinels squatting there nodded and bowed their heads, dreamed perhaps of the dank, chill forests of their harsh homeland, while their watchfire flickered and sank under the wood shadow. Death hovered over them in those few seconds of passing gloom. They never knew it, nor paid any heed to the slight choking sound, half anguish, half fury, instantly stifled as Kermorven caught rein of his temper. There were only a few faint scufflings among the rubble then, that might be rats climbing after carrion, and they too faded and were gone. In the darkness, the wall seemed to go on upwards forever. Elof moved almost in a daze, hardly able to believe the cliff-like heights he scaled were the works of men. The massive stone blocks he clambered over, as great almost as those of the mastersmith's tower, must rather have been hewn and raised by the creatures, human and animal, who stood as carved pillars on the houses below. Very fair those houses had been in the days of their pride, but pitiless gleams of passing moonlight revealed them like hollow teeth, crownless now, jagged, blackened, empty windows agape, or yet smoldering, pitiful as the skulls in the fields. Bodies lay unburied on the rubble at their bases, or found a grave of sorts beneath it. Only a limb thrust grotesquely out, or simply a smear of blood across the paving, dust gilded already and trampled in by many feet. It was a mixture of wonder and horror too rich for the smith, too much the nightmare of his youth writ grotesquely large. He wrapped the darkness he carried tight around himself, to see no more than he must. Sir Morven clambered on, thin-lipped, without looking back. Only Ills seemed little impressed with the city or the carnage. except to shake her head wonderingly at the foolish strife among men. When they reached the top of the wall, clambering over the rubble of the blasted parapet, she stopped and shivered. I feel very high up here, and out in the open. Is that shadow thing of yours fading? Elof looked around and nodded. It has lost many needles, amid too much stone. Then save it, said Kermorven. Do you bestow it safely, for we may need its last powers yet. Up here behind the battlements we should be able to pass without it, if only we tread silently. They moved then like sentinel spirits above the shattered streets, agleam with Ekwesh watchfires. The battlements were broken in many places by catapult shot, and the flagstones of the parapet cracked. Here and there the wallhead had fallen away, leaving gaps they had to jump across. Many of the defenders who had fallen on the ramparts yet lay there, in places so thick it was hard to step among them. White faces and wide eyes yet staring up at the travelers as they passed. To Elof, they seemed to be asking why he had come so late, and from Kermorven's expression, he felt much the same way. It seemed like a century, though it cannot have been more than an hour, before they reached the southern flank of the outer wall, and found their path blocked. Here, as in other places where outer wall drew close to inner, a short bridge had been built between them, defended at either end by a high gatehouse, turreted and galleried, straddling the parapet in front of them. Tall gates of iron, blank and featureless, barred the way along the wall. Elof looked hard at them, wondering about their weak spots, but knew he could not break them silently enough to avoid an alarm. Tread softly here, whispered Kermorven, for we do not know who holds this part of the outer wall, and dare not simply knock. I have no wish to be quilled through by my own folk, if they are too hasty to challenge before shooting. We must see them first. So I rely on your eyes, Ills. He peered into the deep shadow beneath the turret. I see nobody on the gallery at this side, nor on the bridge, nor at the windows. If there are sentries, they must be watching the outward side. How can you hope to get past? Climb across to the bridge, of course, said Kermorven, and padded forward, unwinding a rope from his pack, while the others gaped in disbelief. And from thence to the far rampart. The outward side of the tower is featureless to discourage grapnels, but on the inward side there is guttering. I will go first, and hold you if the rope will reach. With long, swift fingers he knotted it round his waist and sprang swiftly up onto the top of the battlements, crouching so as not to be seen against the sky. When he reached the guttering, he straightened up swiftly and inched his way out spider-wise, long limbs outstretched, face flat to the stone. The others heard his taunt whisper, "The rope, too short. Follow as best you can, Ills. Then you, Elof." Ills swallowed audibly, but managed to clamber up with Elof's help. He heaved himself after her, steadfastly refusing to look down, but when he reached the corner of the gatehouse, he found her frozen in the way, her face leaden in the moonlight. "Bold," he whispered. "Your mountainsides are higher, delvings deeper." Not so open, he guessed, nor without a single handhold. He felt his own palms go moist at the thought. "Eris," hissed Kermorven. "Come on, you." Elof swallowed detached an arm from the rope and caught Ills around the waist to steady her. With that encouragement, she began to shuffle forward again, a little unsteadily, but gaining ground as she went. Elof saw that her eyes were tight shut. He inched along after her. Sword slapping awkwardly at his legs, wondering if he really could hold her. Short of stature she was, but solid. But at last there was Kermorven, balanced on a waterspout, reaching down to help her over the rim of the battlements onto the parapet behind. In helping her up, Elof staggered, and for one nightmare moment, looked down into the shadowed pit of rooftops beneath. Then Kermorven's hand reached out to him also, and he was tumbling over the ramparts onto the grimy stone. They lay there a moment in the deep shadow of the gatehouse, in a gasping heap, catching their breath, savoring a sudden release from tension. Then Kermorven chivied them afoot in fierce whispers, and turned to climb the far side of the bridge. But just as Elof scrambled up, the swordsman spoke in his ears. "Psst! What's that?" They stared. In the shadows at the far end of the bridge, something glinted, shifted, shimmered, came clearer. A tall figure took shape, clad in bright mail covered by a dark surcoat. He was busy removing his helm, like a weary sentry coming off watch. He looked up, started violently, and swept out a great sword. Kermorven made no move to draw, but stood calmly, watching. The armed man hesitated. "Who goes?" he demanded. His speech was like Kermorven's, but gruffer and less precise. "Speak, or I'll—" "Has the moon gone to your head, then, that you do not know me, Rohan?" demanded Kermorven in return. The newcomer stopped dead, stiffening with evident amazement. The moonlight shone clearly on his face now, and Elof all but choked. He was very tall, taller even than Kermorven, and more broadly built, certainly older. His hair was jet black, long and waving glossily around his neck, though only a few strands straggled across the top of his pink scalp. His beard was equally thick and glossy, with the same stiff wave in it, the eyes heavy-lidded and still, the nose long, straight but slightly bulbous. It was a well-made face in its way, but to Elof, for a moment, it seemed very terrible. There was no fine resemblance. The overall likeness of cast and coloring was so strong that, just for a minute, he had mistaken the man called Brihon for the mastersmith. Brihon took one jerky step forward. "You!" he barked, and his sword flashed up. Within the inner gate, there was a soft clatter of arms, a scuffle of heavy boots, and 4 mailed men came spilling out onto the bridge, looking from him to the newcomers with cold, alarmed eyes. 3 had short bows drawn ready in their hands, the 4th an arbalist. Their surcoats bore the same claw device as Brihon's. The dark man cocked a shaggy head at the travelers. "Do you look at this, then, lads, and believe it if you will. My lord Kermorven comes swarming up walls in the watches of the night." "Kermorven?" croaked one of the men, and gaped. Kermorven, who had made no move to draw his own blade, inclined his head slightly, as if acknowledging a salute. "Now, why do you suppose he was doing such a thing?" said Brihon icily. "And at such a time? I'd, of course, be risking breaking his banishment. I was never banished, Brihon, said Kermorven evenly. You cannot banish a man in his absence. Which is why you left so abruptly, smiled Brihon. How do you know the law has not been altered? Because the people are not yet so foolish, Brihon. Brihon shrugged. I'll not bandy follies with you. In all but name you were banished. And the last we heard, you'd fallen in with just such a pack of sea raiders as we find praying at our gates. He shook his head grimly. And only this day were all the syndics wondering how a crew of savages could plumb our defenses so well. Now we know, I fear. Kermorven's whole face seemed to narrow, eyes and nostrils pinched tight with fury. And yet he still laid no hand to his sword, and spoke coldly. At another hour, you might regret that, Brihon. But it was forgetting all old wrongs and enmities I came back, bringing a great help in our need. An army, then? And did you lose it along the way? I see nothing about you but a pair of thralls as ragged as yourself. I am no thrall, growled Elof, straining to copy the swordsman's measured coldness. My name is Elof. I am a journeyman smith out of the Northlands, and this is the Lady Ills of the Duergar. We serve no man save as friends. How fortunate a man of his high station, said Brihon, without once appearing to notice Elof, to count as his friends vagrant blacksmiths and vermin. He shook his head and smiled as if in quiet satisfaction. Good humor smoothed his voice. No, my lord. Even if all you said was true, still, we could not have you coming back at such a time, sowing discord among the weak-willed and undermining the authority of the syndics. In the people's interest, it cannot be tolerated. You invoke the people so readily, Brihon, said Kermorven, his voice still calm, but taut beneath, as if he could barely believe what he heard. Why not ask them? The dark man shook his head again, and there was now no mistaking the cool gloating in his tone. Alas, indeed, that we will not be able to do. But you might confuse enough of them to begin with. Even the rumor of your coming would split the city in strife. Better that they hear no more of you, or blame the Ekwesh if you were found. Kermorven's sword hissed from its scabbard, and Elof's came snarling in its wake. Ills hefted her axe for a cast, but the bows were already leveled, distance too wide. Elof knew that however fast Kermorven was, he could not outrun an arbalest bolt. Bitterness welled up in him as he tensed for the last useless spring. To have come this far, this hard, to lose all, some infantile squabble. Halt! The voice that echoed along the parapet had none of Brihon's suavity, but it was commanding enough to match him. Halt there! Put up those bows! First man loses is cannibal meat. What in all the pits of hell is afoot here? Brihon turned on the burly figure in mail and helm who came stumping round the gallery of the gatehouse above, then looked warily as the inner gates opened upon a cluster of men armored alike. Who are you to countermand my orders? Do you not know who I am? Aye, Syndic, I do, said the newcomer firmly. Just a citizen like everyone else, as you're always telling us. Not even in command of this quarter. As to who I am, I'm a sergeant of the guard. Mind telling me what you and your followers are doing up here at this hour? Not had enough fighting today that you must be about the ramparts all hours of the night? As well that I was, with you guardsmen asleep, said Brihon venomously. I caught these traitors sneaking up here. Aye, so I saw, sir. And being a guard, and all wide awake, seemed a mite hasty, if you'll pardon me, sir. Look here, Sergeant. We are besieged. Cannot waste time on trials. These creatures are our enemies. The sergeant shook his head. Can't agree with you there, sir. See, it's like this. The long one and the plump lass I can't avouch. But there's one I know is no friend of the Ekwesh, 'cause he's a good mate of mine. Eh, Alv? And he turned to Elof and pulled off his helmet, spilling out a shaggy mass of red hair and a hot red face beneath. Or what was it I heard you call yourself now? Elof? Elof stumbled forward in utter confusion and delight. Rock! Rock, you son of a smith! The former forge boy gave him a polite but dignified salute and turned to Brihon. Anyway, sir, this comes under the hand of the syndics captaining this quarter. I've sent for one, and he'll be along any time. Take the matter up with him if you care to. No? Then I'd be obliged if you and yours clear the ramparts before the reavers hear the row and loose off a catapult, just for laughs, huh? Brihon looked at him a moment with blank, resentful eyes. Remember this, he said quietly, gestured to his men, and stalked past the guardsmen into the gate. The sound of boots on stairs rang away into distance and depth. Go shake your ears, muttered Rock, and held up a hand to check Elof's eager questions. Better wait a moment. Wait for the syndic. I'll handle this. After the tension of the wall and the meeting with Brihon, delay was agony. The travelers fidgeted in silence under the eyes of the guards, though it was mostly at Kermorven they stared, with, it seemed to Elof, a strange mixture of fear and reverence. His kinship here was obvious. Many had his cast of features, though less fine, even those whose hair was red or black, or that strange golden shade that reminded Elof uncomfortably of Lohi. It was perhaps half an hour before they heard more feet approaching. Among them a noticeably lumbering step. More guardsmen came crowding out of the gate. In their wake, a burly man of some height, dressed in a rich but rumpled fur-lined robe, who glared sleepily at the travelers. Now then, Rock, what river spawn are these that cannot wait till morning for me to look them over? Then he peered closer, and his jaw dropped till his red beard blended with the fur of his color. Here is Gate. It's Kermorven. Then he turned, peered at Elof, and roared with laughter. And by the black arse of Amikak, he's got this Causeway Smith in tow. And we thought the Boggles had carried you off. Rock grinned. The look of him now, sir, he'd scare the Boggles. Well, be thankful he's on our side, then. Bring them up, lad, bring them up. Kermorven smiled wryly down at Elof as they were ushered up into the tower, guard's room. It seems you are as well known in my homeland as I, and better liked it, maybe. Elof chuckled. Lucky, at all events, that I fell upon the only two friends I have here. Luck? Rasped Rock. Still don't credit me with a brain in my skull, do you? Had your description posted with the city marshals for 2 years now, on the off chance you might wander in. Price on your head, attached only. Not that large, but they remembered. Luckily, I wasn't far. Elof whistled. Yes, or Brihon might have wasted our coming. Oh, they'd have stopped him, I think. Anyway, you're here now, and Cathel's a powerful friend to have, as I've found. Cathel grinned toothily at Elof. You need money to be a syndic, lad. Some inherit it, like Brihon. But I made it on that last trip. I'll not be forgetting them who helped me then. Him. Or you. He looked at Ills, subsiding wearily into a chair, and at Kermorven. It was a look of wary disapproval, but not outright hostility. But then there's this lady, and there's you. Why do you come back? Come to crow that you were right all along? Or turn out us syndics in the middle of all this? What is it brought you? The need of my city, said Kermorven gravely. And Elof. He had better explain. The tale took less time in the telling than Elof had feared, for Cathel had already heard much from Rock. He's my armorer now, you know. Has his own little forge, but keeps my housecarls in tin plate, when he isn't too busy mending the kitchen maid's kettles. He laughed uproariously for a moment, then grew serious. You're telling me it's this misbegotten Mylio, the ones that we see stirring the savages up? They are more than savages, said Kermorven grimly. They have a great realm after their fashion, and it grows crowded. They would have come here anyway, at first to raid, then to settle. Mylio has merely brought them sooner, or they are truly ready. If you say so. And with that sword thing, huh? From Vade's tower, too? A bastard cat of a sea hag? It is not where I would choose, agreed Kermorven, looking at his friends. I heard many tales about that place when I was young, and some were very dark. It was a small palace once, and is still rich inside. Mariners' Guild maintained it when I was a boy. In days of peace, still burn a beacon on its roof to guide ships. No man has lived there for many generations. It is not a favored place to sleep. We've seen lights there after dark, said Cathel. So it looks like he doesn't mind. Kermorven smiled thinly. Perhaps the Ekwesh like to brave such things, or Mylio feels at home among them. But if Vade walks there yet, they will find him restless company. Let them beware. Cathel pulled his robe tighter about him. That's no fit jest. Wish Vade would return, alive or otherwise. He'd settle this whole filthy crew, mine sword or no. But you seem to think you've a parry to it. When that was answered, Cathel looked at Elof, and glanced uneasily at Ills, dozing in her chair. From Duergar teaching, and you'd trust such uncanny stuff as that? Ills opened an eye and glared at him. This place is a madhouse. We come to help them, and they call us vermin. Treat us like foes, or worse? Cathel shook his head. These are hard times, lady, and confusing ones for a man who's just trying to do what's best for his city. An hour ago, I wasn't even sure there were such folk as you. And the last I saw young Karen Kermorven, he and his factions were mobbing the syndicacy steps against Brihon's bunch, breaking every pate they could reach and calling down curses on the rest. Can't help but leave scars. That or on more than Pate's. Though I'll admit he was younger then, that the times have proved him more than half right. Question is, what in the fires of Hela do I do now? He stood up and walked over to the window, though it was boarded over. By rights, I should hold you for the marshals of the city to examine, and refer what you've told me to the syndicacy. All of which, with things as they are, would take another day at least. Do you think you've got another damned day? Demanded Ills. Cathel looked at her. No, in truth I do not. My heart misgives me. Another wall down and there will be panic. For who can fight the storm? We can, said Ills. Her face was as proud and hard as the stone of the city. We three. We four, grumbled Rock. By your leave, Syndic. Wild folk need looking after. And I've a word or two to say to my late master. Or. Morven smiled coldly, but he nodded. Cathel looked long and narrowly at Ills, at Rock, at the smith, and the swordsman, and tugged at his beard. The eyes of a merchant weighed them up, but the spirit of the rover burned behind them. By the sun ascending, I believe you. You folk, if anybody. Out of the olden times you were come, it seems, and the hero lays, and of prowess and power and wizardry, such as I had never hoped to see, such as I doubted could exist. Old and fat and fond of my life, me, but if I could in duty come, even to bear your spears, and into the open jaws of Amakak I would. He sighed. But I am sworn here, where folk depend on me, and war brooks no delaying. So, this I will venture and take upon myself, to set you free, and to give you rest, food, arms, any help you need. He drew a deep breath, as one who has crossed a threshold he fears. Use it well. Sir Morven rose swiftly. I thank you, Syndic. The food we will take, but no rest. It is now fast upon midnight, and we must make our move soon. Nor do we need arms. Ills wears mail. Elof will wear none save that gauntlet. I have carried my own mail over land and sea for this hour. He tote at his ragged pack, and a heavy parcel of oiled leather spilled onto the table. He unfolded the dully gleaming mail and helm, and took from inside a smaller package, equally well wrapped. Now, let us eat. It was a hasty meal, a quiet one. Elof and Rock tried to chafe each other as befitted old friends at last free to talk. But what lay ahead stood as a barrier between them, deadening merriment. Ills seemed disturbed by this city of men, gazing uneasily around the walls, sniffing suspiciously at the food, taking only what others tasted, though it was common fare enough. Sir Morven, already clad in his mail, ate in silence. That was not his usual calm, fingering over the small package, and when Cathel's summons came, he sprang up at once and left his plate half full. Fresh clothes awaited them, chosen in dark colors, and black cloaks to go over them. Ills found some dark wax to rub on her bright mail shirt, but Elof left his gauntlet as it was, wrapping a fold of his cloak around it. Rock had a long knife in his belt, and swung a heavy mace from his wrist. Better that than a sword for a man of sound figure such as me. Powers, what a fearsome crew we look. Any Equesh that see us die of fright. Or laughter, my lad, if he sees you first, said Cathel as he led them out of the guardroom. As well, there'll not be too many people about at this hour, or the sight of you'd lower their spirits. But there were folk about, for when Cathel led the little party out onto the bridge again, a murmur went up from the inner walls around, and arose from the streets beneath, where many lanterns and torches ate away at shadow. It was a rushing, rustling sound, like the wind running among reeds, a word repeated from one to another among a great crowd. Name: Orvin. News travels fast, growled Rock in an undertone. But then, this is what half the city's been praying for since the black sails first showed on the horizon. And the other half has been blaming me for it, no doubt, as Brihon did. Kermorven looked around anxiously. The noise was growing louder, threatening to become a shout. Is it Kermorven? Is it? Is it? Save us, Lord! Shouted an old woman. Down with the syndics! No, up! Shouted a coarse voice. A rope for their necks! A rope for the fat syndics! A rope! It's their doing! Save us, Lord! Scatter the savages! Cathel, pale with fury, was trying to bellow above the row, futilely. More and more people were gathering along the ramparts. Sorry creatures, many of them in flame-scarred clothes and soiled bandages. They did not look poor or underfed, all the more desperate for that. Sudden orphans from a secure daily life. Elof heard Kermorven curse, saw him swiftly unroll the package, and strap something between the shoulder plates of his mail. Cathel's breath hissed between his teeth. Hold up a lantern, Kermorven barked at the guardsman, and stepped forward into the pool of light. The warm glow gilded his bronze hair, his pale, proud face with its hollow cheek under high cheekbones, and set a chilly flame in his shadowed eyes. A gasp went up from the crowd on the wall, and then a rising rumble of excitement. He flung up his arms suddenly, with greater effect than that if he had shouted, for the lantern light glistened upon the breastplate he had added to his mail. Dull black it was, darker than the rest, but demasked in gold upon its surface was a strange pattern. An image it was in an intricate style, of a blazing sun, and before it, rising with open beak, a great raven with the eyes of a man. The silence was so immediate that Elof could hear the ripple of his mail shirt. Then came a long sigh from the crowd. Kermorven looked around him, unsmiling, and spoke in the quiet voice of his which was yet like distant trumpets. Save your acclaim. Make no noise, none at all, or you will alert the enemy. But as you see, I am Lord Karen Kermorven of Morvan. I have come back as I said I would. I will do what I can in the defense of Brihane. All of Brihane. For never did we need to stand together more than now. So no more of this talk of ropes. The syndics never sought my life, whatever others may have wished. For now, follow them. Follow this man Cathel, and any whom he names in his turn. For there is virtue yet among the syndics, like gold, since one must often delve deep for it. Laughter rippled, and the mood was turned. He drew his cloak over the emblem. Now go, and my blessing with you. Go in peace. As quickly as it had gathered, the crowd began to disperse. He turned to Cathel. What little peace yet remains to them, poor wretches. Are you content? Cathel nodded soberly. It seems gold is commoner than I thought it. Yes, I am. Then do take it upon yourself to make ready sortie and assault. Give me a horn such as the guardsmen use, when you hear it from the tower, and perhaps the raven should also fly from the fortress." Cathel opened his mouth to protest, and then said nothing. "All right," he managed at last. "No small favors you ask, you heroes. I'll risk this, but afterwards." Grimorvan shrugged quickly. "There will be more voices in that than yours and mine. Come, we waste time." The doors of the outer gatehouse were opened for them, and at once shut softly behind. They were where they had sought to come, on the last stretch of the outer wall that led straight to the harbor and the Tower of Vade. Rock looked uneasily at Elof. "Don't like this. Our dear master's bad enough, but what else is in that tower? Well, my blood runs icy just thinking." "But I thought Vade was one of your great heroes," said Ills. "Wouldn't he be on our side?" "A hero of a sort," grunted Rock. "But they say he built that tower beyond the city walls, as was then, 'cause, well, he kept odd company." The tower loomed ahead of them, immense in girth and height, featureless, lightless, darker than the darkness and as inescapable. There was no feeling of emptiness about that grim silhouette. None at all. Rather, its fullness seemed to spill over, mingle with the dark, tinge it with menace. Through the eyes, that tower. To look away from it too long was to fill the mind with strange fears of what might have appeared there meanwhile. Some watching, questing apparition. But looking too long served only to people it with the flickering phantoms tired eyes create, and to risk breaking your neck on the shattered and rubble-strewn rampart into the bargain. It was hard going. Worst for Ills with her short limbs, having to clamber where Grimorvan could bound. Rock was in little better ease, and weighed down by full mail. But when Elof, balancing a moment on tilting stone blocks, was tipped over by the gauntlet's weight and almost fell, it was their strong hands that bore him up. Rock and Ills. Friends. He had never had friends when he was a boy. He felt suddenly like sending them back, like ordering them back, instead of casting them away in this mad enterprise of his own making. Grimorvan, too, who should only be asked to fight against an ordinary foe, and not the unnatural wiles of smithcraft. Let mage take mage. Cancel out both. Let the normal folk, the unstained, untainted folk, go on to lead their normal lives, as was their right. But not his. On the Anvil of Ice he had met his forging, and the stamp of it he would never quite lose. What if he succeeded here? What would he be then? Where would he go? Picking his way among ruin and slain, he could find no answer. Here the fighting had been fiercest, the city folk rallying under the warrior hero's memorial. How many of these bodies sprawled here had died calling on that name, wondered Elof, looking with dimming eyes for his return. What name would he call on when his turn came to join them? Suddenly, Grimorvan, leading with drawn blade, thrust out his arm and fell to a crouch. Elof saw then what lay ahead. As they had expected, there was a rough barrier thrown between intact battlements. Behind it, an ember glow lit the forms of Ekwesh guards, nodding wearily. They had settled how to deal with this, and as Ills and Rock drew level, they sat a moment to get their breath. Then Elof drew the black sword, ready to muffle its strange voice, but it was a soundless, thrilling tremor in his hand. Ills hefted her axe, and Rock twirled the mace into his hand by its wrist strap. Grimorvan waited a moment longer, snapped down his visor, and sprang away, bounding from stone to stone with his cloak blowing like some vast bat, up on the battlements and across the barricade before its sleepy sentries could rouse. There were 10 Equish there. They were swept down as by a wind before they could utter a sound, stricken where they stood, or hewn over the wall onto the ravaged roofs beneath. And the travelers were dashing along the last length of the wall, heading for the dark arch of the door that led into the tower. It was not locked, for its lock had been smashed out from within, no doubt when the Equish took the tower. Beyond it, Elof saw at first only a wide hall, lit by a single guttering lamp, and a few doors ajar on darkness. It was the smell of the place that struck him first. Smell of still air, heavy with age and dust, and the peculiar scent of damp, heavy cloth. He realized then that the strange bulky shadows in the corners were great gathered swaths of tapestry, a material so heavy and so dusty that it looked like stone in the half-light. Colors faded, its pictures reduced to meaningless swirls. Cobwebs, equally dusty, hung around it as if in mockery, and from the great octagonal table at the center of the room. But around this, the dust had been quite tracked away by the passing of many feet. At the far side, one wide double door opened onto a wide flight of stairs, lit by moonlight flooding through high casements in the tower wall. On these, the dust was less disturbed, so that individual footprints could still be seen. "He'd come here," whispered Rock softly. "Seemed like home to him, it would. But which way, up or down?" "On the floors below lie the public rooms, halls, and audience chambers, and below them, butteries and servants' quarters," Grimorvan whispered. "Those stairs serve the private apartments. Only 4 floors of those, 2 to a floor, and 1 on top, with a great open gallery. I am certain now there is somebody living in them. The Equish would normally ransack a place like this, looking for a gold thread in the tapestries, if nothing else. This has been kept undisturbed, so it will surely be someone not of their people who is up there." "Then let's be searching," said Ilse cheerfully. "I'll spy out your way. Save you blundering into the furniture, right?" In single file they made their way across the wide stone floor, treading with infinite care lest a boot scrape too loudly. Rock found that most difficult of all, and more than once he staggered and almost overbalanced against the table. But in the half-light on the stairs it again proved to be Elof who saw best, and he took the lead. It was a wide spiral staircase, as in the mastersmith's tower. 3 could walk up it, arm in arm, and its roof was high and vaulted, hung about with shadow. More tapestry lined the walls, less dusty. Elof could make out whole scenes in the fitful moonlight, lines of wagons, battle and slaughter under trees, and once on a great plain. It was an uncanny place, such as he had never been in before, and he sensed that his friends liked it no better. He felt a strange, deep chill run through the middle of his body, from chest to groin, and his feet felt numb and weak. What had this Vade been like, who might yet walk here? He could imagine hearing footsteps high above, strong, heavy feet marching inexorably down through the dark on this staircase, where they could only go over you, or through. And yet that somehow failed to chill him. He felt a different terror in this place, a clinging sense of anguish, sadness, ultimate loss, and somewhere beneath it a consuming anger that seemed to echo around the walls like an ancient cry of resentment. That frightened him, as it so closely matched something in himself. He failed here and was broken or struck down. Would he too become part of that? Would the voice of his misery also echo down the long years? He stopped. They had come to a landing, a wide corridor running down between rows of doors, some small and plain, some high and ornate. One in particular on each side rose above the others. Double doors with an ornate transom window above them. But the dust of the corridor was undisturbed. They looked at each other, and Elof gestured up the stairs. Grimorvan nodded, and they moved on. The next floor was the same corridor, same undisturbed dust. And the next also. And Elof began to wonder if they were being foolish, if the mastersmith were not peacefully asleep in one of the very tents they had passed by out there in the twilight. He turned, hesitantly, wondering if he should not go down at once. Well, time yet remained. But it was then, if ever, he felt a true presence in the tower. The darkness rang like a bell, like a voice, a vast, wordless, forbidding note. He looked wildly at the others. They only looked doubtfully back at him. They had heard nothing, that was clear. What could it be? But shrug and lead on. And on the next floor, the last before the top, lines in the dust led down the long corridor together to the high doors, where they divided, one turning into each. Elof flexed the fingers of his gauntlet. Grimorvan nodded grimly and hefted his sword. "Hawk, hills," he mouthed in the faintest of whispers. "Best that someone guards the stairs, till we are sure." They looked sulky at that, but nodded. Grimorvan arched his eyebrows questioningly, and waved his sword from left to right. Elof shrugged and gestured to the left-hand door. Carefully, minutely, he picked his way down the corridor on silent feet. The door was unlatched. He put his ear to the crack and heard a soft sound of breathing. Soft, even asleep. He nodded to Grimorvan, bit his lip, very gently pressed the door a little ways open, enough to see dimness and dark inside. Slip his fingers round the edge, lifting the heavy wood slightly, so, moving it without the hinges creaking. Then he held up a hand for Grimorvan to wait, pointing to his eyes. It was ill-lit in there. He could see better. Grimorvan's mouth narrowed, but he nodded in return. Elof peered cautiously through the narrow opening. He found himself looking across a large, gloomy room and through another set of doors, standing open into a wide, high-ceilinged chamber. It was lighter than it had first appeared, for two tall casements flanked the curved wall opposite, set in deep bays with an upholstered seat beneath each. Between them, almost to the high ceiling, rose the pillars of a great bed, carved with tracery and hung about with tapestry less gray than that below. It was gathered back so we could see that in the bed a figure lay, that the hair against the white pillow was black. He swallowed hard and stepped forward, half crouching, gauntlet outstretched with the fingers wide, sword clenched tightly in the other hand. 1 step, 2, 3, careful strides that carried him across the open expanse of the room, between the pools of moonlight that the pale sky spilled through the windows. He had all but reached the end of the bed when something caught his eye. A light shape draped carefully across one of the window seats. A garment, mantle, all in white. He gasped involuntarily. Sudden whirl of fabric, figure in the bed sat up. He saw the bedclothes fall away from a slender body. It was a woman, the moonlight bathing her small breasts, showing him her face. It was well for him his dry throat strangled his startled cry. He tried again, and could whisper no more than her name. Kara. She started, peered into the dark. Ooh. And then she gave a little gasping shriek and rose on her knees, the arm ring gleaming under the moon. He flung himself onto the bed and into her arms. He gathered her up against him, marveling at the warmth, the slightness, sweet scent of her, startling strength of the arms round him. They babbled at each other, foolish, incomplete words. Their cheeks ran wet, and they knew not, nor cared who it was wept. Their lips met, but could not cling for lack of breath. He let fall his sword. His hand caressed her back, hers his, and the two acts were as one, the product of a single will. It's all right, he whispered breathlessly. All right, he repeated, without knowing whether anything would ever be right again. Elof. He held her at arm's length suddenly. How did you know? How did you know my new name? Oh, he, breathed Kara, shivering violently. Here, the other room. Suddenly she gasped and broke away from him, looking past him to the door. In the middle of the room stood Kermorven, his face so utterly void of expression that it contrasted weirdly with his ready stance and blade. He swallowed convulsively, about to speak when Elof furiously waved him out. Where's the other door? He hissed. I'll follow. Get out. He turned to her. The friend, he meant no harm. Bid him, for his own good, go far from here, said Kara bitterly, then anxiously. Oh, Elof, be careful. You're in terrible danger. I've heard her talk to the mastersmith about you. And he is here too. She nodded and shut her eyes, as at some sudden pain. I tried to escape. I did try on a journey southward. I broke free, but... He brought up her legs from beneath the covers. Round each ankle wound a strangely coiled ring of silver. They were bound together by a thin, intricate chain that was the length of a short stride only. Elof's narrowed eyes, a gleam coursed through it that was not of the moonlight. An anger to match his own flashed into her eyes. She caught me, and at her behest, he did that. In a rush of fury, Elof caught the chain up in his fingers, as if to twist it apart. Could not, nor would even the black blade do more than scratch the metal. A forge, he growled. We will get you to one, and see whose will is the stronger. Lohi, she dies this minute. No, gasped Kara. Oh, you must leave. He will destroy you. He will call him upon you. Think, if she can hold even him in thrall. I will cast him down first, said Elof between dry lips. Then we will see, she and I. Where does he sleep? Do you know that? He pointed upwards. The highest floor, the great chamber. There he dwells, but sleep? Do not think he sleeps. He is changed, grown even stranger than he. I think she does that to those she holds. Not changing you? Kara shook his hand and held it to her breast, and he felt the heart leap beneath. I am of no sort, he whispered, and smiled through her tears. A stronger chain than any and forge was already upon me. I will not change. He nodded. Nor I. She kissed him again, more solemnly. Now get dressed. You must come. Shook her head and pointed to her ankles. I cannot. I am not leaving you here alone. Not now that I've found you again. Must. Does your friend not wait? She stared out of the casement to where the pale moon sank. But listen, love, life. If ever any chance or power parts us any more, follow the dawn. Seek to the east. I win free, shall quest westward for you, path of the moon. I swear it, all that I am. He nodded, for he could not speak, touched her lips once more, and rose, catching up his sword. He looked at her there, watching him, felt his heart blaze up within him, as if her gaze kindled it to flame. He backed away. She sank and dwindled into the shadow, so the flame died, faded. Only the darkest ember remained. With a last glance back, he stepped through the open door, and almost trod down Ilse, standing rock-still in the middle of the corridor with a terrible look on her face. He glanced anxiously at the far door, but it was undisturbed, and he waved her angrily away. The others were gathered on the stairs. Who is she? Demanded Kermorven. Can we trust her? He met Elof's eyes and said no word more. Rock nodded. I've seen her once. I know, Elof. If he trusts her, why should we not? Fair question, asserted Ilse. She is this Lohi's and not yours. That much I heard. Remember, our lives and many others depend on it. He is not up there. If meanwhile she raises the alarm, then we are cut off. We cannot fly off this tower. He is there, said Elof coldly, and gazed about him. I should never have doubted it. Felt it on the stairs. Very stones crowd in protest. Every metal fastening rings alarm in my mind. He warned me, wishing me to escape. Kermorven eyed Elof anxiously. You grow strange to me in this strange place. I would not trust what that lithe little creature said, the bonds that lie on her soul. But I fear we have no choice. Must venture it now. Ilse bowed her head. Yes, you are right. We are at her mercy then. Lead on. The night hung deep across the last staircase, for the moon had set now. Elof clambered on, step after step, and the warning of the forest rang over and over in his mind. Something more. Something he would know when most he needed it. Fear, fear of failure, fanned the dying ember at his heart. Now, even, you unknowns, you mocking powers, when else will I most need it, if not now? I am within my enemy's walls. Holds the girl I love in thrall. Go to face him with a weapon he may brush aside in scorn. When? Not now. He rounded the last corner and stepped up in sudden light. It was no ordinary light of lamp or fire, no healthy glow, but a bluish, sea-deep gloom, the daylight of drowned men. Came spilling down the stairs through the wide ceiling trap in which they ended, fantastically shadowed by the wrought railing to either side. He stepped cautiously up till his eyes were level with the floor above, and peered quickly around. The apartments here stretched the whole width of the tower. A great central chamber leading out into a wide, curved balcony. Around the walls of the chamber, behind a circle of carved pillars, were various other doors, all closed, and there seemed to be nobody visible. The chamber itself was a mess, a clutter of old furnishings and dusty hangings like the tower below, but intermingled with newer things that lay strewn in heaps about. Rich things for the most part, vessels of precious metals, rich garments and hangings, arms and armor well decorated, bright jewels and ornaments, carvings, paintings. By the balcony, against a pillar, stood a robed statue of some white stone. A hideous mask of Equesh fashion tilted casually atop it. A chest of coins stood open against the far wall, and above it, a faceted globe of glass in a curiously wrought stand, from which the strange light came. And everywhere lay books, heaps of books, packed scrolls and bound boards laid in eccentric piles. Trenchers of food lay here and there atop them, half-eaten. The air was heavy and stale, with a hint of foulness, as if some beast had layered there a while. In all the confusion, nothing stirred. Slowly, carefully, Elof mounted the last steps, and Kermorven behind him. The warrior's face darkened with anger as he took in the scene. Dreamings, this, of the loot of the city, small parts so far captured. Elof knew the warrior must be seeing not only the worth of it, but the bloodshed, shattered homes and ruined lives that were the price each piece bore. Kermorven looked around and nodded jerkily, clearly thinking this a likely enough lair for the mastersmith. So did Ilse by her face. But Rock dared to whisper a doubt that mirrored Elof's own. Was ever so damned particular. He dwell in such a stein now? Kara said he had changed. This is what she meant. Perhaps indeed, said a thin, smooth voice, though they had scarcely breathed their words in each other's ears. As one they turned to look across the room, the black gap of the balcony. And there the statue, too, as they had all thought it, turned to face them. But I am sorry if fault. These are the hardships of a campaign among allies, largely civilized. Though I confess I grow more forgetful of the common things of every day, the temporary impurities, fouled soil in which thought must for the moment grow. Elof and Rock, who had known the man before, only gape. The voice, once resonant, had thinned to a dry metallic edge, and the rest of him had withered to match it. The skin on his hands was white and featureless as a smooth swath of gown he wore. Strands of his hair, once lustrous, black, and curling, could now have been the fibers from which the gown was woven, lying lank about his face. As they watched, tilted back the long, beaked mask of the thunderbird from his face. It too was white. The beard shrunk to blanched wisps. Even now, it might still have been a statue's face, or more properly, death mask. For the same placid calm rested upon the closed eyelids, faintly smiling mouth. And the eyes snapped open. They were also white, clouded and milky behind lashlet lids. Looks like a cave slug, muttered Ilse. Slimy, pale, and eyeless. Never a drop of red blood in him. But the master smith smiled courteously to her, and to each of them in turn, as if to demonstrate that he was not blind. "Welcome, Ills, Lord Karen Corvin, and to you, my boy, Rock, and who is yet the Alv I knew. See, I know you all. Your coming was not unheralded." Ills glared at Elof. "Not by Kara," he said quickly. "He did not know who was with me, or our names. This comes from within the city." "Not unheralded," I said. "You are an innocent boy, adrift in a world you do not comprehend. The play of forces beyond your perception, and beyond your childish concepts of good and evil, of rights and does not the storm drown a mariner? Selfsame wind will drive the ships of many more to safe haven. You cannot have one without the other. A fair wind in one corner must be fierce. The world is a single great a linked chain you cannot even begin to envisage, of which even I have only been permitted to grasp a single portion. Great suffering occasioned here is only in the case of ridding life of all its that the rule of pure mind be restored, world cleansed. A fair monument wiped clean of filth scrawled on it by fools, purified by the power of this. Kermorvan snarled something and pushed forward, but Elof held him back. Throughout my growing years, I heard this, and much like it from fine word. Fine enough, almost, to dignify a lust for wealth and power, bought even at the expense of your own humanity, I see. Almost. Not quite. The snare that caught me then, I will not step into it a second time. Even if all you said were true, I still would prefer my childish notions, my duty to those who have befriended me. I will never sacrifice them to some invisible future good, some fair wind elsewhere. Storm threatens, let it beware. The Mastersmith's blank face twisted a moment. You have sacrificed them, and they who would fight the storm must laugh. And reaching swiftly among the heavy folds of the robe, he caught hold of a scabbard and hilt. So it was that out of the deeps of the years, most fell work of Elof's own hands arose to confront him. It gleamed in the wintry light, that sword, its flowing, enigmatic patterns bright as the day when he had deemed his work done, and exulted without a thought for what might thereafter befall. As it shone before his eyes, it seemed to him independent of he who brandished it. He saw it more as he would his own face distorted in a mirror crazed and shattered, a facet of himself malformed and twisted. It was in revulsion only that he thrust the gauntlet up to block it from his sight. But that served him well, for no greater fear or horror descended upon him. Yet Kermorvan, barely within the blade's influence, was convulsed as if by a bolt of lightning. Grey gold sword twisted aimlessly in his hand. Limbs jerked, his spine snapped rigid, arching his head back, and from wide-stretched lips he shrieked aloud, terribly loud, a racking, terrible sound of animal terror and agony. He stumbled back, clutching at his head as if hot metal ran within it, utterly unmanned. He blundered into the wall and rebounded against ills and rock, though perhaps shielding them somewhat, though they cowered away as one would from the sudden opening of a furnace door. They caught the tall man as he fell, bore him up swiftly, and dragged him kicking back to the steps. His scream had done its work nonetheless, for from the dark below echoed shouts, slamming of doors, the ring of steel-shod feet upon the stairs. The sword shifted its direction, wavered away from Elof and towards his friends. Sir Morven, grey-faced and furious, struggling to rise. But Elof sprang forward after it, keeping himself between it and them, shouted back over his shoulder, "Get you below, and him with you. You might yet make the door." "No chance," shouted Ilse. "They come. We will help you." "You cannot. Hold the stair. Cut your way out if you can. This is for me alone." He saw her nod and swing herself down the steps, Sir Morven stumbling after her. Below, there came the sound of blade on blade, Locke's furious bellow. Now the sword swung no longer, but pointed straight at Elof, and he felt the sheer power of it pour about him as if it were a rapid he was fording, ever threatening to sweep him off his feet. Desperately, he closed his fingers in an attempt to catch it in. There was too much, too strong a flow. It spilled between his fingers and poured its frothing waves of fear and horror into him. His hair bristled, his heart hammered. It seemed that the floor split at his feet and an abyss gaped there, himself swaying on its brink, hearing the shrieks that echoed upward. He struggled against the current, gasping, choking like a drowning swimmer. His sight began to dim. Images of terror swirled up before his eyes, shapeless at first, then shadows that gathered and coalesced, flying at him like dark wings riding a storm wind. Flung his own sword up against them. For a moment, it too became a thing of horror in his hand, dripping with marsh slime that became the foulness of a corpse split open, rotting and reeking down across his hand, pooling about his ankles, bogging down his steps. But only for an instant. Another image rose up around the marshblade. The hand that had first wielded clutched it down into a mighty death. A hand no longer blackened and shriveled, but strong, fell, resolute. Hand of a man hewing foes down in droves before him, even as his life ebbed, marsh ensnared his limbs. Elof had taken that blade as his, set himself within it. With it he had, all unknowingly, taken on him its weighty inheritance. He could not now dishonor it by doing less. He fought forward, thrusting himself into the heart of the terror he faced. He dimly heard the sounds echoing in the stairwell, hoarse shouts, dull hammering of arms, the harsh, rasping gargle of a life flowing away. All the black dreams he had dreamt came flooding back against him then. All the visions his fever had conjured up, sweating there among the soot of his forge upon the marshlands. Clawed fingers, bodies in the wagon, Ingar crumbling away under his hand, Kara a mocking wraith, all mingling into one fearful shape of death and decay. Endless essence of life. He felt as if he could endure no more. His heart and mind and will were tendons in a tortured hand, stretched to their limits and beyond, only waiting the last vicious twist, snap in consummate agony. But in none of these fearful things did he find that final force. They came not new to him, as they might have. His trials and suffering, he had faced them. The worst of him they embodied once before. And though they still clawed at the very depths of him, yet he found he could face them now. In grief and regret, he leaned forward against them as he might into a gale, and like leaves they scattered around him, stuck a moment, hurled away. He could acknowledge the guilt that was in him, balance it against what else he found there. He could guess at a price paid, make a clear decision. He was sure of himself at last. Seen more? He struck forward still like a swimmer. On. Felt the rush of horror falter an instant. Darkness ebb. His eyes cleared suddenly, and he found himself staring almost into Master Smith's face. Beneath the weird mask's frame, it was his own gray mask of fear, that Elof should win so close. The pale man staggered back, waving the sword wildly to fend him off. And then in a paroxysm of utter panic and desperation, he swung up the patterned sword and struck with all the force in his smith's arm, straight at Elof's unshielded body below his breastbone's end, and thrust him through. Elof folded forward around the surge of icy, incredible agony, staring foolishly down at the thing that invaded his body. Catched by pain, his mind floated free, watching his own red blood spill out along the blade as an idle spectacle, an interesting exercise, seeing it flow among the patterns he himself had set there, linking them, uniting them at last into a script he could read, a pattern he could understand, that leaped fully formed into his mind. He knew at last the whole meaning of the symbols he had set in the sword. Dimly, through his roaring ears, he heard an exultant yell from the stairs, a cry of sheer joy from Ilsa's powerful lungs, and the sound of a body clattering down steps. Rock, too, was shouting. Above all, there rose like a vengeful trump the bitter cry, "Orvin, Moorland Hall!" Then he was convulsed again by agony as the sword was jerked free of him, with a cruel twist to it that seemed to tear him asunder. Yet he laughed aloud as he clutched his hand against the wound, feeling the blood run warm across the gauntlet. There came the sound of many running feet, cries of fear cut short, the noise of more who fell, and toppling their fellows, went tumbling away into the depths, a panic, a rout. "The biter is bitten," he gasped, and staggered back against the wall. "The thief is robbed, and by his own hand. Do you hear, my Leo? Do you hear? Something more was needed, he told me, and now I know what, indeed. You, master, that you are, must needs be greater yet, steal a power that you did not understand. You would have a sword to cleave the mind, to set a man's own fears against himself, drown his reason in its own black depths. But the edge that would cut the spirit is blunted by grosser thing. Sword of the mind, not also strike the body, that you have made it do so. What is it now?" The mastersmith leveled the sword at him. Elof laughed only the louder. The gray man turned, ran to the stairs, recoiled, and pointed it into the dark gap, jabbing desperately at the air as if to drive something back from the opening. But out of it, step by measured step, exorable as fate, rose a terrible figure of Kermorven. No longer did that fearsome warrior falter or fall. He had lost his helm. He was wounded in face and leg. The blood that sprayed in gouts across his mail steeped his sword and sword arm scarlet from point to shoulder, not his own, nor did it shine brighter than the wrath that sprang glittering into his staring eyes. Mastersmith fell back, still gesturing uselessly with the sword, and Elof wept weakly with the pain of his mirth. "Where are your guards, Mylio? Call them back, bid them slay your foes for you now. Why do they flee? What is it that has gone out of them?" Then the Master-Smith whirled. Speed of madness, he hurled himself upon Elof. The sword that was now no more than a sword, upraised to strike him down in a last, hopeless vengeance. But Elof swept up his own sword, and in his vision had done. Then, with the arm of a smith who had proved mightier, half falling forward, he hammered it down to meet the thing he had made. With a cry like an eagle, black blades stooped clashing upon patterned metal, struck through unstaying and passed, down through the painted wood of the Thunderbird mask, through the blue steel death's head within, through the softer skull beneath, on, down to cleave the Mastersmith Mylio nearly in two. A husk, filled thing, is dashed to the grimy stone of the floor. Halves of the patterned sword dropped spattering among the blood. As Kermorven ran up, horrified, they twisted and flexed there like some unclean beast severed, till little by little, cords of metal sprung, split, separated, unwound, and writhed apart. Up the stairs now, yelling exultantly, came Ills, one arm black with blood, bearing up Rock, who was gashed badly in the leg and shoulder. But she fell silent as she saw the body of the Mastersmith, though she looked on it unmoved and snorted. "Surprised the thing still bleeds red." Then they saw Elof, stumbled towards him, forgetting their own ill. But he waved them back, hugging his own pain to himself. Kermorven stooped, seized the shattered body, and swiftly dragged it out onto the balcony. He looked out, saw below him on the riven wall black-clad men mustering, low, reluctant, all chiefs and shamans in patterned robes screaming at them in furious exhortation. Then Kermorven laughed aloud, a bitter laugh and cold, blew a great blast on the horn he bore, and it went out and echoed across the rooftops, among the towers. Other horns answered it, horns that sounded many different tones, silver and gold, brass and steel, the dour blaring of steer horn. For the alarm had spread. Many waited and watched. Raised up in his arms, high over his head, grim thing that had been their chiefest enemy. The blood run seemed to stain the very sky red with dawning. Many cries arose then from the wall below, and from beyond the untaken walls a solemn fanfare sounded. The first faint light glinted back 1,000-fold from moving files and blades bright burnished. And atop the golden crown of the highest tower a small bundle rose up the mast, broke, fluttered wide. It was a battle pennant all of sable, with upon it a sunburst in gold, even rising to seize it. Orvin cried out in a voice that echoed about the walls of the city, that leapt across the scaled roofs and quivered in the very windows of the crowned tower. "Orvin Morlenhall! Orvin shall rise! Up, Bryhane, and strike them down, or see, they fall!" And with a heave, he hurled the body of the Mastersmith out over the balcony, plummet limply down upon the broken wall below. the very feet of his driven chieftains, held by the power he had long usurped, dashed there into shapelessness. Awesome, it seemed to them, and terrible beyond words, that what they had deemed so powerful could be so suddenly cast down. They fell back, clansmen with them, scraping frantically at the blood that bespattered their robes, lest it carry with it some taint, fearful reverse. "Ithel has kept his word," said Kermorven. "Now, Elof, we must get you." But where Elof had stood, there lay only the black sword, sadly wrung and twisted in a pool of bright blood. From it a trail that led them to the stairs. Down that last flight Elof stumbled, thick with agony, coughing down the blood that bubbled in his throat. From the streets below came the first clash of arms as the men of the city, heartened anew, cast off the night, formed out to engage their oppressors. From the Ekwesh camps came stuttering drums, urgent now and uncertain. Elof paid them little heed, for they and all else seemed to reach him now from behind a thick, stifling gray curtain, and he yearned to cast it off, free. Only there was Kara, little Kara. Saw her all the more clearly when all else had faded. He knew he must reach her room. Found it by staggering along the walls, almost falling against the door he had left ajar. Even as he plunged through, he saw the bed empty, high windows crashing open in the wind. He dragged himself across to them. Below him, the Ekwesh, neither a driven force nor a coherent army any longer, streaming away through the streets they had lately taken. Under the fluttering ensign of raven and sun, and of the city fell upon them without let or restraint. Even women and children snatched up the weapons of their fallen enemies and harried them as they ran, hewing without mercy any who fell or were cornered. The few who stood to fight were overborne and trampled before their weapons could bite, shield walls broken before they could form. No longer driven to attack, no longer held in concord with their ancient rivals, riven of the will that had led them so far into this venture, sorcery that had smashed the walls before them, witness to its last fearful fall, fever chieftains broke, panicked, turned to run. Under banner after banner sounded the call to retreat, to regain the ships and the freedom of the sea, where they might yet be secure. Rout and riot overtook them amid the rattle of the drums, and those who were yet within the city saw their own ships being pushed half-manned from the beaches, being cut from their anchors and sails frantically unfurled. So it was that at last none sought anything but the harbor and the escape, rather than face the wrath of the folk of Kerbrahan. To their own lands they carried a fearful rumor of that wrath, but also shame unshriven, dishonor unavenged, art and fester worse than the wounds they bore. But Elof did not look upon what he had brought about, for he was staring eastward, into the golden light that poured now across the distant hilltops, bathing the land as if to cleanse it of the stain of war. Circling there, vanishing into it with great, slow wing beats, flew two swans, one white, one black. About the feet of the black one there shone a gleam of silver. Then Elof's weakness overwhelmed him at last, and he sank down, onto the seat where the mantle had rested. His hand, now black and stiff with blood, sank away from his chest. And there stood Ills, Rock, Kermorven, staring at him in pity and horror, but also strange dismay. He looked down and tore suddenly at the ragged edges of his jerkin, laying bare his flesh beneath. No more than a faint line marked it, faded even as they watched. His wound closed. Thus it was that Elof came to the true end of his apprenticeship, and the warrior servants of the ice were for a time driven back from the Southland. So concludes a volume of the Winter Chronicles named the Book of the Sword. But it records that Elof was to lie ill, despite his strange healing, many long months, till spring was come again, and the beat of swan wings across the sky. Only then, as the Book of the Helm recounts, he set off on his journeyman's travels, that were to bring him in the end great understanding, great suffering, great love, name of Elof Valantor, Elof of the skilled hand, mightiest of all mage-smiths amid the dark days, ancient winter of the world.